The Battle of Malvern Hill, also known as the Battle of Poindexter's Farm, was fought on July 1, 1862, between the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, led by Gen. Robert E. Lee, and the Union Army of the Potomac under Maj. Gen. George B. McClellan. It was the final battle of the 7 days battles during the American Civil War, taking place on a 130-foot elevation of land known as Mulvan Hill, near the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, and just 1 mile from the James River. More than 50,000 soldiers from each side took part, using more than 200 pieces of artillery and 3 warships. The 7 days battles were the climax of the Peninsula Campaign, during which McClellan's Army of the Potomac sailed around the Confederate lines, landed at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula, southeast of Richmond, and struck inland towards the Confederate capital. Confederate Commander-in-Chief Joseph E. Johnston fended off McClellan's repeated attempts to take the city, slowing Union progress on the peninsula to a crawl. When Johnston was wounded, Lee took command and launched a series of counterattacks, collectively called the 7 Days Battles. These attacks culminated in the action on Mulvan Hill. The Union's 5th Corps, commanded by Brig. Gen. John Porter, took up positions on the hill on June 30. McClellan was not present for the initial exchanges of the battle, having boarded the ironclad Uskalina and sailed down the James River to inspect Harrison's Landing, where he intended to locate the base for his army. Confederate preparations were hindered by several mishaps. Bad maps and faulty guides caused Confederate Maj. Gen. John Magruder to be late for the battle, and excessive caution delayed Maj. Gen. Benjamin Huger, and Maj. Gen. Stonewall Jackson had problems collecting the Confederate artillery. The battle occurred in stages. An initial exchange of artillery fire, a minor charge by Confederate Brig. Gen. Lewis Armistead, and 3 successive waves of Confederate infantry charges triggered by unclear orders from Lee and the actions of Maj. Gens. Magruder and D. H. Hill, respectively. In each phase, the effectiveness of the Federal artillery was the deciding factor, repulsing attack after attack, resulting in a tactical Union victory. After the battle, McClellan and his forces withdrew from Mulvan Hill to Harrison's Landing, where he remained until August 16. His plan to capture Richmond had been thwarted. In the course of 4 hours, a series of blunders in planning and communication had caused Lee's forces to launch 3 failed frontal infantry assaults across hundreds of yards of open ground, unsupported by Confederate artillery, charging toward firmly entrenched Union infantry and artillery defenses. These errors provided Union forces with an opportunity to inflict heavy casualties. In the aftermath of the battle, however, the Confederate press heralded Lee as the savior of Richmond. In stark contrast, McClellan was accused of being absent from the battlefield, a harsh criticism that haunted him when he ran for president in 1864. Background: military situation in spring 1862, Union Commander Maj. Gen. George B. McClellan developed an ambitious plan to capture Richmond, the Confederate capital, on the Virginia Peninsula. His 121,500-man Army of the Potomac, along with 14,592 animals, 1,224 wagons and ambulances, and 44 artillery batteries, would load onto 389 vessels and sail to the tip of the peninsula at Fort Monroe, then move inland and capture the capital. The bold and sweeping landing was executed with few incidents, but the Federals were delayed for about a month in the siege of Yorktown. When McClellan's army finally did attack on May 4, the defensive earthworks around Yorktown were undefended. After some hours, the Army of the Potomac pursued the retreating Confederates. When Union troops encountered the Confederate rearguard at Williamsburg, the 2 armies fought an inconclusive battle. The Confederates continued their withdrawal that night. To stymie the Southerners' retreat, McClellan sent Brig. Gen. William F. Baldy, Smith to Eltham's Landing by boat, resulting in a battle there on May 7. When the Union Army tried to attack Richmond by way of the James River, they were turned back at Drury's Bluff on May 15. All the while, McClellan continued his pursuit of Confederate forces, who were withdrawing quickly towards Richmond. The lack of decisive action on the Virginia Peninsula spurred President Abraham Lincoln to order McClellan's army to move into positions close to Richmond. By May 30, McClellan had begun moving troops across the Chickahominy River, the only major natural barrier that separated his army from Richmond. However, heavy rains and thunderstorms on the night of May 30 caused the water level to swell, washing away two bridges and splitting the Federal Army in two across the Chickahominy. In the subsequent Battle of Seven Pines, Confederate General-in-Chief Joseph E. Johnston sought to capitalize on the bifurcation of McClellan's army, attacking the half of the Union Army that was stuck south of the river. Johnston's plan fell apart, and McClellan lost no ground. Late in the battle, Johnston was hit in the right shoulder by a bullet and in the chest by a shell fragment. His command went to Maj. Gen. Gustavus W. Smith. Smith's tenure as commander of the Army of Northern Virginia was short. On June 1, after an unsuccessful attack on Union forces, Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, appointed Robert E. Lee, his own military advisor, to replace Smith as the Commander-in-Chief of the Confederate armies. The subsequent 2 weeks on the peninsula were mostly quiet. On June 25, though, a surprise attack by McClellan began a series of 6 major battles over the next week near Richmond, the 7 days battles. On the first day, as Lee led the Army of Northern Virginia toward the Union lines, McClellan preempted him with an attack at Oak Grove. Lee's men successfully warded off the Union assault, and Lee continued with his plans. The next morning, the Confederates attacked the Army of the Potomac at Mechanicsville. Union forces turned back the Confederate onslaught, inflicting heavy losses. After Mechanicsville, McClellan's army withdrew to a position behind Bosun's Swamp. There, on June 27, the Union soldiers suffered another Confederate attack, this time at Gaines's Mill. In the resulting battle, the Confederates launched numerous failed charges, until a final concerted attack broke the Union line, resulting in the only clear Confederate victory during the 7 days. The action at Garnett's and Golding's Farm, Fort Next, was merely a set of skirmishes. Lee attacked the Union Army at the Battle of Savage's Station on June 29 and the battles of Glendale and White Oak Swamp June 30. But all 3 battles were inconclusive. After this series of conflicts that inflicted thousands of casualties on both armies, McClellan began to position his forces to an imposing natural position atop Mulvan Hill. Geography and location: it was as beautiful a country as my eyes ever beheld. The cultivated fields, interspersed with belts and clusters of timber and dotted with delightful residences, extended several miles. The hills were quite high, but the slopes gradual and free from abruptness. Wheat was in the shock, oats were ready for the harvest, and corn was waist-high. All were of most luxuriant growth. Lieutenant Charles B. Hayden of the 2nd Michigan Infantry, personal diary: Mulvan Hill, a plateau-like elevation in Henrico County, Virginia, provided an impressive natural military position about 2 miles north of the James River. The hill rose some 130 feet to its crest to form a crescent about 1.5 miles in length and 0.75 miles wide. Its slope was about 1 mile in length and very gradual, with only 1 or 2 notable depressions. Along the western side of the hill ran Mulvan Cliffs, a bluff-like formation that overlooked Turkey Run, a tributary of nearby Turkey Island Creek. Western Run was another tributary of Turkey Island Creek, which lay mostly along the eastern side of the hill and slanted slightly into the northern side. One depression dipped some 60 feet of the valley of Western Run and slanted upwards to the plateau. Mulvan Hill center was slightly lower than the flanks. The gentle, bare slant meant that any assailing army could not easily take cover, and artillery would have the benefit of a clear, open field. Several farms were positioned near Malvern Hill. Roughly 1,200 yards north of the hill were the Poindexter and Carter farms. Between the two farms was a swampy and thickly wooded area that made up the course of Western Run. The largest in the area was the Mellott family's farm, usually called the Crew Farm for a former owner, situated at the western side of the hill. About a quarter of a mile due east of Malvern Hill was the West Farm. Between these two farms lay the Willis Church Road, which some locals called the Quaker Road. This road also ran past the Mulvan House, the hill's namesake, which was perched atop the southern edge of the plateau. It was, altogether, an exceedingly formidable position, wrote historian Douglas Southall Freeman. Had the Union engineers searched the whole countryside below Richmond, they could not have found ground more ideally set for the slaughter of an attacking army. Prelude. Key participants: McClellan's forces prepare. A few days prior to the action on Malvern Hill, McClellan incorrectly believed that the Army of the Potomac was vastly outnumbered by its Confederate foe, and his fear of being cut off from his supply depot left him cautious and wary. On the night of June 28, McClellan told his generals that he intended to move his army to a position on the north bank of the James River called Harrison's Landing, where they would be protected by Union gunboats. The Army of the Potomac came to Malvern Hill, the Army's final stop before reaching the landing, with approximately 54,000 men. On the morning of June 30, 1862, the Union 5th Corps under Fitz-John Porter, a part of McClellan's Army of the Potomac, amassed atop Mulvan Hill. Col. Henry Hunt, McClellan's skilled chief of artillery, posted 171 guns on the hill and 91 more in reserve in the south. The artillery line on the hill's slope consisted of 8 batteries of field artillery with 37 guns. Brig. Gen. George Sykes's division would guard the line. In reserve were additional field artillery and 3 batteries of heavy artillery, which included 5 4.5-INCH Rodman guns, 5 20-pounder Parrott rifles and 6 32-pounder howitzers. As more of McClellan's forces arrived at the hill, Porter continued to reinforce the Union line. Brig. Gen. George Marrell's units, stationed between the Crew and West Farms, extended the line to the northeastern section. Brig. Gen. Darius Couch's division of the 4th Corps, as yet unbloodied by the skirmishes of the 7 days, further extended the northeastern line. This left 17,800 soldiers from Couch's and Morrell's divisions at the northern face of the hill, overlooking the Quaker Road, from which the Federals expected Lee's forces to attack. Early the next day, Tuesday, July 1, McClellan, having come from nearby Hacksaw's Landing the night before, examined his army's battle line on Malvern Hill. His inspection left him worried most about the Union Army's right flank, which lay behind Western Run. Western Run was an area necessary for McClellan's plans to relocate to Harrison's Landing, and he feared an attack might come from there. As a result, he posted the largest portion of his army there: 2 divisions from Edwin Sumner's 2nd Corps, 2 divisions from Brig. Gen. Samuel P. Heintzelman's 3rd Corps, 2 divisions from Brig. Gen. William Franklin's 6th Corps and 1 division from Maj. Gen. Erasmus Keyser's 4th Corps, who were stationed across the James. The division under Brig. Gen. George McCall, badly damaged in the fighting at Glendale with McCall himself wounded and captured, was held in general reserve. McClellan did not believe his army was ready for a battle, and hoped that Lee would not give them one. Nonetheless, he left his troops at Mulvan Hill and traveled downstream aboard the ironclad Uskalina to inspect his army's future resting place at Harrison's Landing. McClellan did not delegate an interim commander, Porter, who was in command during the initial attack. became the de facto leader on the Union side of the battle. Lee's forces advanced with around 55,000 soldiers. The Army of Northern Virginia was about evenly matched with the Federals, and with Lee at the helm, notably more aggressive. He wanted a final, decisive attack that would effectively scatter the Federals. Several pieces of evidence, abandoned commissary stores, wagons and arms, and the hundreds of Union stragglers and deserters his units had happened upon and captured, led Lee to conclude that the Army of the Potomac was demoralized and retreating. In all the battles up to Malvern Hill, Lee's plans to destroy the Federal Army had failed for one reason or another. Though he was undeterred, his chances for decisive victory were diminishing quickly. Early on the morning of the battle, Lee met with his lieutenants, including Marsh, Gens, James Longstreet, P. Hill, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, John Magruder and D. H. Hill. D.H. Hill, after talking with a chaplain familiar with the geography of Malvern Hill, cautioned against mounting an attack. If General McClellan is there in strength, Hill said, we had better let him alone. Longstreet laughed off Hill's objections, saying, don't get so scared, now that we've got him. McClellan whipped. Lee chose the relatively well-rested commands of D. H. Hill, Stonewall Jackson and John Magruder to lead the Confederate offensive, as they had barely participated in the fighting of the day before. Meanwhile, James Longstreet's 1st Corps and A. P. Hill's Light Division, who had fought the majority of the previous day's hostilities, would be held in reserve. According to Lee's plan, the Army of Northern Virginia would form a semicircle enveloping Malvern Hill. D.H. Hill's 5 brigades would be placed along the northern face of the hill, forming the center of the Confederate line, and the commands of Stonewall Jackson and John Magruder would take the left and right flanks, respectively. Whiting's forces would position themselves on the Poindexter farm, with the outfits of Brig. Gen. Charles Sidney Winder and Richard Ewell nearby. The infantry of these 3 detachments would provide reinforcement for the Confederate line if necessary. Marsh, Gen. Theophilus Holmes would take up a position on the extreme Confederate right flank. Disposition of armies. The Army of the Potomac's disposition in the lead-up to the battle was more orderly than Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. All of McClellan's forces would be concentrated in one place, save for several divisions from Marsh, Gen. Erasmus Keyes's outfit and Keyes himself, who were posted across the James River at Hacksaw's Landing. A Confederate scout observed Union soldiers resting in position, and moving about the hill unworried, whilst the disposition of the cannons around the hill's slope gave him the impression that the position was almost impregnable. McClellan's army was on the hill in force. Throughout the 7 days' battles, Lee's forces had been separated and scattered due to swamps, narrow roads and other geographic obstacles, and occasionally due to unclear orders. As the days of marching and fighting wore on, the number of stragglers swelled to fill narrow roads and significantly deplete the Confederate ranks, presenting a significant additional strain on their combat readiness. These hindrances continued during the Battle of Malvern Hill, with both Magruder and Huger making mistakes in the deployment of their forces. At first, Magruder's units were behind Stonewall Jackson's column while marching down the Long Bridge Road, which led to Malvern Hill. Along this road were several adjoining pathways. One such road, called the Willis Church Road by some locals and the Quaker Road by others, led south from Glendale to Malvern Hill. Lee's maps labeled this Quaker Road. Another of these paths began near a local farm and angled southwest toward an upriver point on a river road. Some locals called this the Quaker Road, including Magruder's guides, who led Magruder's army down this road rather than the Quaker Road shown on Lee's maps. James Longstreet eventually rode after Magruder, and persuaded him to reverse course. This incident delayed Magruder's arrival to the battlefield for 3 hours. Huger, worried about clashing with Union forces while marching towards Malvern Hill, had also failed to manage his division effectively. He deployed two of his brigades, commanded by Brig. Gens. Lewis Armistead and Ambrose Wright, to perform a flanking maneuver around any Federals they found, to avoid the Union threat. Longstreet eventually notified Huger that he would be unobstructed by Federal forces if he marched to Malvern Hill. Huger, however, remained in place until someone from Lee's headquarters came to guide them to the battlefield. As noon drew near with no sight of either Huger or Magruder, who were supposed to be manning the Confederate right flank, Lee replaced these two forces with the smaller units of Brig. Gens. Armistead and Wright, two of Huger's brigades that had reached the battlefield some time earlier. Huger and his other two brigades were still too far north of the scene. Despite the mishaps and disunity, Malvern Hill would be the first time during the 7 days battles that Lee managed to concentrate his force.